Jake and I were always the types of friends who loved a challenge, and when we heard about the abandoned house on the old country road, we couldn't resist. Curiosity won out over any fear. It was an old house, isolated, way off from any neighborhood, and every time we passed by, something about the place felt off. The front looked filthy, with broken windows and an overall vibe of total abandonment. But the night we decided to go in, the place felt darker than ever. It was cold, and the sky was covered, like time had just stopped right there, in that patch of land. We walked in through the front door, which was slightly ajar, and the first thing we noticed was the musty smell. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the place was covered in a thick layer of dust. I was looking around, trying to find something interesting, but all we saw were old furniture and broken wooden crates scattered all over the floor. The air felt heavy, like time itself had frozen inside. Jake, braver than me, wandered off to explore more, while I stayed in what seemed like the living room. That's when he called me from the back door, where the old house led to a barn. He wanted to check it out, and of course, being the adventurous friends we were, I followed. But I had no idea what was waiting for us. As soon as we stepped into the barn, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was darker than the house, and as our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we started to see piles of wood stacked up and rusty tools scattered everywhere. The smell was worse in there, a mix of dirt and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Jake was already drifting further away, checking things out with more focus, and I, feeling a strange pressure in my chest, kept walking slowly, trying to stay calm. But then, I started hearing soft footsteps behind me, and my heart skipped a beat. They were so quiet that I thought it might just be the boards creaking under my own steps, but the footsteps repeated, and I knew for sure I wasn't alone. I looked over at Jake, who seemed to be oblivious, and tried to hide my fear, but the sound kept getting closer. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched hit me full force. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw something I still can't explain to this day. A dark shadow moving in the corner of the barn. It wasn't just a shadow. It looked like a tall, distorted figure. My instinct was to scream, but I couldn't. All I felt was this urgent need to get out of there, so I grabbed Jake by the arm, and we started running toward the door. When we got there, the door was locked, and we tried everything to force the lock, but nothing worked. Panic set in, and then, through the window, I saw him. Someone standing outside, staring straight at us. He was motionless, his face impossible to read. And the worst part? It looked like he was waiting for us. The terror was so intense that my body froze for a moment. I looked at Jake, and I could see that he was as pale as I was, not knowing what to do. We tried forcing the door again, but it felt like it was locked with something way stronger than just a simple padlock. I could feel the man's gaze from outside, like he was studying our every move. Each of our breaths seemed louder, as if the silence around us was a trap. Jake whispered, "Let's go. Let's try the window." But when we got to the window, it was locked too, and when I looked outside, the man was gone. All that remained was the feeling that he was surrounding us, watching us every second, even though we couldn't see him. That's when we heard the sound. A low noise coming from inside the house, like someone was walking through the hallways really close to us. Jake and I looked at each other, and I felt a wave of desperation. Whatever it was, it seemed to be everywhere. We decided to run to the back door, which led straight into the woods. But when we got there, we were faced with something even stranger. The gate was open. How could it be open if it was locked when we arrived? I felt like something was leading us out, and all we wanted was to escape this nightmare. So, without thinking twice, we bolted outside and ran, desperate, toward the woods. The sound of our footsteps seemed to echo, like the earth itself was swallowing us up. I didn't know what was waiting for us, but one thing was for sure. We would never go back to that place. We ran for what felt like an eternity, not daring to look back. The only sound we could hear was the sound of our heavy breathing and the branches cracking beneath our feet. The fear was so intense that I couldn't even think straight anymore. I just knew I had to keep running. Finally, after what seemed like forever, We stopped to catch our breath. The silence of the forest wrapped around us, and for a moment I wondered if the man was still out there watching us. But we didn't hear anything else. Whatever had happened in the house seemed to stop right there, like it had all been a nightmare. When we finally made it back to the road and saw the car, the feeling of relief was almost tangible. The adrenaline was still rushing through us, and the fear hadn't completely faded. As we sat in the car, in silence, Jake looked at me and said, "You saw that guy, right?" I could only nod, unable to respond with words. To this day, we still can't figure out what happened that night. The house, the man, everything felt unreal, like time had warped right there. We never went back to that house, but I still catch myself thinking about what really happened that night. The worst part is that we can't explain it. We'll never be able to. And the strangest thing of all, after that night, the house didn't look the same when we passed by. Every time we looked at it, it seemed different, like it had aged, deteriorated even more. But there was no longer that feeling that something was inside, like before. It was as if the place had gone quiet, silent, like it had swallowed everything that happened, but at the same time still carrying that feeling that something was waiting for us inside. I don't know what it was, but I know I'll never forget that night. Every time we drive past that road and I see that house, my stomach turns. To this day, we've never been able to find a logical explanation for what we went through. Whether there was really someone watching us, or if it was something much more sinister, we never knew. But the fear I felt that night, the feeling of being hunted, that will never leave me. The strangest thing of all is that, even after everything, I still have the impression that the house is still there, waiting for someone. Maybe I never truly escaped it. And no matter how hard I try to forget, one thing is for sure: the house, the man, everything that happened stays with me, and I'll never be able to explain it.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was a calm night, but something about that delivery gave me a discomfort I still can't explain. I got a request for a house out in the middle of nowhere, far from any other lights or signs of life. Once I hit the road, I realized there was nobody around. The house sat at the end of the street, surrounded by thick darkness, with no cars anywhere nearby. Only the porch light, flickering in a weird, inconsistent way, stood out in the dark. That flickering light made me feel like the house was abandoned, but I kept going anyway. After all, it was just another delivery. Or at least, that's what I thought. When I pulled up in front of the house, I noticed something odd. Despite the darkness, the door was slightly ajar, and a man appeared, but his behavior immediately gave me a strange vibe. He had no expression on his face, but the way he stared at me made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. Instead of taking the food and thanking me, he asked me to come inside. I froze for a second, holding the food in my hands, not sure what to do. It wasn't normal for someone to ask me inside, and there was something about his demeanor that made me tense. The door was open enough for me to see the dark, silent interior, and that only added to the heavy feeling in the air. That whole situation just didn't sit right with me, and something inside me screamed to get out of there fast, not just because of the man's strange behavior, but because of the atmosphere around me. I could have just followed protocol and left the food on the porch, but he kept insisting that I come inside to hand it to him. I was still trying to process everything when suddenly the man made a quick move, almost like he was stepping aside to let me in. I took a deep breath and quickly handed him the food right there, not giving him any room to push further. As I turned and started down the small steps from the porch, the worst thing happened. I heard the sound of the door slowly closing behind me. That feeling that something was off hit me like a cold wave. My heart started racing, and the only thing on my mind was getting out of there as fast as I could. But just before I could get to my car, I felt something, like a presence. I glanced back at the front window, and there he was, the man, staring at me. He wasn't at the door anymore, but was standing behind the window, eyes locked on me with no expression, like he was waiting for something. The worst part was that he didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. He just kept staring silently as I backed away. I hurried and jumped in my car, trying to stay calm. Deep down, I knew I shouldn't have gone there, but all I wanted in that moment was to get the hell out of there. The road was empty, and the only lights I could see were my headlights reflecting off the trees lining the road. Every turn felt longer than the last, and the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something move behind me, but nothing did. That stare was like still in my head. As I reached a more lit section of the road, I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I was finally free from the bizarre situation. But then, something strange happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow in the car window, and before I could focus on it, it disappeared. I froze. What scared me the most was that the shadow seemed to be inside the car, not outside. I started to question my sanity, thinking I was becoming paranoid, but the feeling that something was still there was undeniable. The shadow didn't have a clear shape, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. My hands started sweating, and I couldn't stop looking at the rearview mirrors. It was like fear took over every thought. The rest of the drive felt endless, and every turn made my heart race faster. When I finally got to the busier part of town, I started to calm down. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But something told me that the fear I felt didn't just come from the dark road or the strange house. There was something about that experience that hadn't been resolved. The next morning, I decided to drive by that place again, as if trying to make sense of what happened the night before would help get rid of the fear. As I got closer to the house, my stomach churned. The porch light was off, and the house seemed completely normal. But I knew what had happened there. I saw what I saw. The window where the man had been watching me was fully shut, but I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. Nothing seemed wrong, but everything felt wrong. I couldn't stop wondering what he wanted, what was really going on there. It was like I was stuck on something I could never understand. And since that night, the feeling of being watched never truly left me. I never went back to that house. Never again. I started taking a different route for deliveries, avoiding any isolated streets at night. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what happened, trying to piece together the puzzle, but the more I think about it, the less I understand. The man, the stare, the shadow. There was nothing logical about it, nothing I could explain away with reason. When I shared this with a few friends, they just laughed, brushing it off as a case of nerves or imagination, but I knew it wasn't that. There was something in those eyes, in that house, in that moment that told me I was facing something I wasn't supposed to witness, like it had been some kind of creepy coincidence. Or maybe somehow I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I still remember that night, every detail, and I feel the weight of that sensation of being watched. Even now, when I pass by isolated houses, that image of the man in the window comes back to haunt me. The worst part is that I'll never know what really happened in that house. He never showed up again, and the whole episode faded away as suddenly as it started. But somewhere, something tells me there's still an answer I'll never find.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, away from everything. I was already tired of the city, and when I saw that isolated cabin up in the mountains, I decided it would be the perfect spot to just relax. There was no one around, and the idea of spending a few days alone in complete peace seemed like just what I needed. I got to the cabin late in the afternoon, with the snow covering everything around me. The place was simple, just a fireplace and a few basic things, but that didn't bother me. All I wanted was to get away from the routine and just sit in silence, no one to interrupt me. The first night everything seemed normal, but something felt off. The biting cold wind outside, the complete silence. The kind of silence that makes you question if you're really alone. I spent some time exploring the cabin, getting settled in, and trying to adjust to the place. The cabin was isolated with snow covering the path to the nearest road, but as time passed, I started to get this uneasy feeling. There was no one around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby. I just couldn't put my finger on what was making me feel so on edge. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The place was beautiful, but the snow made it feel like I was in a frozen world where time stood still. I walked over to an abandoned campsite, just a few minutes away. The tents were empty, crushed under the weight of the snow, and what looked like an old dead fire was covered in layers of ice. I didn't see anyone around, but something felt off, like the camp had been left in a hurry, like something had forced whoever was there to leave fast. As I started heading back to the cabin, I saw a shadow in the distance. It was between the trees, just standing still. I couldn't make out what it was, but it felt like it was watching me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. That night, something happened that I just can't explain. I was inside the cabin near the fire when I heard a sound outside. It wasn't the wind like I thought at first. It was something heavier. Footsteps. I went to the window, but I couldn't see anything. The silence came back, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I decided to step outside and check around the cabin. The snow was untouched, no marks at all, until I got close to the front door. Right there, almost hidden, were footprints in the snow, small but clear. Someone had been there not long ago. The thing is, I hadn't seen anyone all day, and now those footprints seemed to surround me. What freaked me out the most was that they didn't look like they came from far away. It was like someone had walked up to my door and then backed off. The footprints in the snow started driving me crazy. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. They didn't make any sense. There were no signs of anyone coming or going from close by. It was like the person, or whatever it was, had just vanished after getting there. I looked around trying to figure out what was going on, but what bothered me the most was the silence. There was no more sound, not even the wind which had been cutting earlier. I went back inside the cabin and locked everything up, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I stayed there, sitting by the fire, listening to every noise, every creak of the wooden floor. I didn't know what to do or how to react. I just felt completely exposed. That's when I heard something else. It wasn't footsteps, but a noise coming from the back of the cabin, something scratching at the wood like it was trying to get in. I froze. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, louder. I ran my hand over my face, trying to calm myself down. I didn't want to believe what was happening, but what scared me the most was the thought that, with every passing moment, I was more isolated. I knew that if something happened, no one would come to help. I felt small, vulnerable. I got up and went over to the back window, barely having the courage to look outside. When I looked, I saw nothing. Just snow and trees. But there, on the edge of the forest, was that shadow again. The figure was there, just watching me. And this time, it seemed closer. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed, stuck in a place where fear seemed to have settled in permanently. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was just my mind playing tricks on me. I needed answers, but when I thought about leaving the cabin to investigate, something deep inside screamed at me not to do it. So I decided to wait. The problem was, the longer I waited, the stronger the fear became. The figure was still there, at the edge of the forest, but it wasn't moving anymore. It just watched me silently. That's when I noticed something else. The snow around the cabin started to melt, slowly, as if the temperature was suddenly rising, with no explanation. The tension was unbearable, and the feeling of being watched was so strong that my body began to shake. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my jacket and carefully opened the cabin door. Outside, the air felt heavy, but the snow had stopped falling. It was as if the world around me had slowed down. Every step I took seemed to be heard by whatever was out there, but the figure, if it was still there, stayed hidden in the darkness. I walked through the field, feeling the wet grass under my feet, when I saw the footprints again. They were there, right at the entrance to the cabin, and now they stretched inside. I looked around but saw no one. I didn't understand, but it was clear that someone had passed through there, but in a way, strange, like they had faded into the night. I still had no idea what was happening, but everything seemed to be getting stranger. The footprints were clearer now, and when I started to follow the trail, I got a chill down my spine. I was in unknown territory, surrounded by something I couldn't understand. I walked up to the edge of the forest, where the snow was thicker and denser. The figure I had seen earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. Then, in the middle of the silence, I heard one last thing. A whisper. Coming from behind a tree, something that made me stop dead in my tracks. I spun around but saw nothing. No one. The sound, however, kept echoing in my head. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The kind of silence that makes you question if you're still breathing. I ran back to the cabin, not looking back, and slammed the door shut. I locked everything up and just stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But that night, the worst thing happened. The sound stopped, the figure disappeared, and nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more whispers, no more feeling like I was being watched. I never figured out who was out there or what happened in that place, but what I do know is that the next day, when I left, the footprints in the snow were gone, like they had never existed. To this day, I can't understand what I experienced in that cabin, and honestly, I hope I never go through something like that again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.